G'day, I'm Mark from Tasmanian Off-Road Adventures. A couple of years ago, a Facebook page that I'm involved with held a survey asking people to vote for their favourite four-wheel drive tracks in Tassie. We took those results and added up the votes and came up with a list of the 12 best four-wheel drive tracks here in Tassie. In this video, I'm going to count down from number 12 to number 7, and in a subsequent video, I'm going to count down from number 6 to number 1 of Tassie's best four-wheel drive tracks. Number 12 on the best four-wheel drive tracks in Tasmania is the Pyengana Jeep track. Now the Pyengana Jeep track is located in northeast Tasmania, approximately halfway between Launceston and St Helens. It's only about 10 kilometres long, so it's not a long track. Time taken will depend on the conditions and which way you go. If you're coming down the track from up towards the Ringarooma end, it'll be much quicker than going up from the Pyengana end. Because it travels through rainforest, it is quite wet and damp, slippery. There are some washouts. There's some pretty big bog holes up the northern end of the track, but there are chicken tracks around those, so you do not have to go through them. My personal preference is to head from the top end and head down to the Pyengana end, and at the end of the track you'll get to the St Columba Falls, which is one of the highest waterfalls in Tasmania. Very spectacular, nice little walk down there. If you keep driving a few k's along the road, you'll get to the pub and the paddock at Pyengana, which is probably Tassie's most iconic pub. They've got beer drinking pigs that you can actually feed beer to, and it's a great spot to stop for a counter meal and or a beer. So as I said, my preference is to go down. It makes a really good day trip, especially out of Launceston. If you head down, check the waterfall out, go to the pub, and then head back up the track. Now the track is more difficult going up. At the bottom, or towards the bottom of the track, there's a pretty slippery clay hill that's a little bit rutted as well, can be a bit of a challenge. And obviously heading up when it's slippery and there are the ruts does make it much more difficult. So quicker coming down, harder and longer to go back up. Now, what sort of vehicle should you take? If you're driving something along the lines of a dual cab ute, like my trusty Hilux here, I'd be looking at a suspension lift and good 32-inch all-terrain tyres. In winter, when it's really wet and really slippery, you may need a winch. I would definitely be travelling with at least one or two other vehicles, just in case someone gets in trouble. There is always the chance, being in a forest, there is the chance that there will be trees across the track, so just be aware of that. If you come across other vehicles coming the other way, it is very difficult to pass. As I said, the track is very narrow, it's quite scratchy, and you will have difficulty passing other vehicles on the track. Not a whole lot you can do about that, and there's no real accepted way whether you go up or down. People do it both ways. All in all, it's a really good track and I highly recommend it. It's not too far from my place where I live, so I really like the track. For me, it probably could have been a little bit higher than number 12, but on our voting on the Facebook page, it came in at number 12. Number 11 is St Albans Bay, otherwise known as the Bridport to Bellingham Traverse, or sometimes known as Double Sandy Point. This is a beach run located in northeast Tasmania, not too far from Launceston, and runs between the seaside townships of Bellingham and Bridport. The track is about 25 kilometres long and it will take you about 2 hours from go to woe, but I highly recommend that you take a whole day to do the track. Around about halfway you'll get to West Sandy Point, which has some great dunes, and especially one big dune that's a lot of fun to drive up and down. At the top of the dune there's some awesome views, so it's great four-wheel driving. That is right next to St Albans Bay itself, which is a shallow bay, and it's fantastic for kids to swim, kayak and do all those sorts of things. There is also campgrounds at West Sandy Point. Unfortunately there's no toilets, but you could make this trip into an overnighter as well. It's not a difficult track, so you could do this track in a standard four-wheel drive as long as you let your tyres down to appropriate pressures. The sand can be soft, especially getting up into the cuttings, into the inland tracks, either on the Bellingham end or sort of more towards around about that West Sandy Point area. I'd recommend that you have at least one other vehicle with you when you do this track. It can be tidal, so especially when there's been high rainfall, there's a river at the Bellingham end called Little Pipers River, and during periods of high rainfall when that's flowing and the tides are up, it can be very, very difficult to cross, and plenty of vehicles have been drowned and written off in that crossing, so you need to be very careful. What I'd do is I'd have a look at the tides on the day you're doing it and plan to cross Little Pipers River at low tide. Number 10 on the list is the infamous $1,000 track. Now, a good mate of mine assures me that he actually coined the phrase the $1,000 track, because every time you do this track you will cause $1,000 in damage. Now, the $1,000 track, it's a little bit hazy as to actually what it is. It's actually two tracks. It's the Coldstream track and it's also the Wombat Flats track. Both tracks start either side of Waratah, and they both head through rainforest and river crossings, and they both end up at an old logging hut where three rivers meet in the Tasmanian West Coast wilderness. The tracks I would rate as difficult, in fact very difficult. They're not for your standard run-of-the-mill four-wheel drive. You will need a decent four-wheel drive with at least 35-inch tyres. Lockers will help, winch is a must, and you're going to have to carry a chainsaw because quite often there are trees and branches across the track. The track is muddy, slippery, has deep holes, and there are some river and creek crossings with very steep exits out of them that you may have to winch out of. So make sure you have all the recovery gear. Definitely travel with at least one, preferably two well kitted out four-wheel drives. I'd recommend that you spend 2 days on these tracks. Come in on one of the tracks on the Coldstream or the Wombat Flats, camp at the logging hut, and then come out the other track. I would recommend that you do this track in summer, or at least in periods of low rainfall. During periods of high rainfall or in the middle of winter, some of the rivers and creeks are going to be flowing way too much for you to cross. Number 9 is Montezuma Falls. Now, this is another personal favourite of mine. It's on the west coast. It's round about halfway between Zeehan and Rosebery. The track's about 15 kilometres long. There is actually a sign at the start of the track that says it'll take an hour to get to the end. Someone's crossed it out and written 2. I've taken as long as 3 hours to do the track, but I'd be allowing somewhere around 2 to 2.5 hours to get to the falls, and then you've got to turn around and come back. There's a fair bit of history with this track. It actually follows an old tramway, the North East Dundas tramway that used to run from the old mining townships of Williamsford and then through to Zeehan. The track is very scenic. You're mainly driving through rainforest. It's always wet on the Montezuma Falls track. It doesn't matter if you're doing it in the middle of the summer, it will always be wet. It is quite slippery and it is quite rutted out. I've seen plenty of people on Facebook ask the question about what the condition of the track is like, and I've seen plenty of people say it's an easy track, it's very doable in a standard four-wheel drive. I would not do this track in a standard four-wheel drive. I would highly recommend, if you're driving something like my Hilux, I would be running a 32-inch all-terrain tyres and a mild suspension lift. There's a few tricky bits on the track. 3 of those are some minor creek crossings. The creek crossings themselves are nothing to worry about as far as water goes, but they are on tight bends and vehicles have gone off over the side of those. Only last summer when we were down there, a vehicle went off the side the day before we did the track, so you need to be very careful. Have a spotter with you. I would highly recommend you have at least another vehicle with you, just in case something goes pear-shaped on the track. The track is very narrow and it is difficult to pass oncoming vehicles. The best way around this is to use UHF channel 10, which is the official channel for this track, and that way you can hear any oncoming vehicles or at least communicate with them as you're travelling along. The best part of this track is there is a great destination at the end, the Montezuma Falls, which is one of the highest waterfalls in Tasmania, and it's fantastic. It's a really great spot to end up at the end of a four-wheel drive track. I'd recommend doing this track as a day trip. It'll take you, let's say, 2.5 hours to get in, have lunch at the falls, hang around there for an hour, hour and a half. There's some other cool little things to check out while you're there, great photo opportunity, then head out another 2.5 hours out, so it makes a good day trip. Number 8 is the Sawback Range Track, otherwise known as the Adamsfield Track in southwest Tasmania near Lake Gordon. Now, this track is managed by the Parks and Wildlife Service and it is gated on both ends. You will need to ring through to the office at National Park, book the track and book the key. You have to pay a $300 deposit for that key, which is refunded upon returning the key. The track is seasonally closed in winter. The track is only about 12 kilometres long. It's a ripper track. It runs through some rainforest, which is very slippery. There's some mud, there are some deep holes, and it does open up onto rocky, rutted plains as well, so it's got a bit of everything. There are some spectacular mountain scenery. Just be aware though too, when you are travelling through the forest bit, it can be quite a scratchy track, so expect some scratches to your vehicle paintwork. If you feel like going for a walk on the track, you can actually walk into the old township of Adamsfield itself and check out the old mining relics. Also, not too much further along the track is also the Clark huts, which are old mining huts. They're privately owned. They were built in the 1940s. More than welcome to have a look around them, but do respect the privacy. As I said, they are privately owned. Towards the end of the track is a shelter that's been built that's a great place to stop for lunch, or if you prefer, if you want to do it as an overnighter, it's a great place to camp. As to what sort of vehicle you'll need for this track, it's really hard to tell. It really does depend on the conditions. I've taken the Hilux through before. It's got 32-inch all-terrain tyres, does have a locker, and I did have to use the locker. I know that people have gone in with bigger vehicles, and I know that people have had to winch through as well. So it really does depend on the conditions, and you should always travel with another vehicle or two if attempting this track. From Go to Woe, the track is 12 kilometres long. It'll take about a 5 or 6 hour round trip from National Park to National Park if you want to do that way, or as I said before, you can camp at the shelter near the end of the track. Number 7 is Rattler Hill, otherwise known as the Star of Peace track. This track is in the northeast of Tasmania, and it's not too far away from the Pyengana Jeep track. There's a couple of different ways you can do this track. You can start down on the Mount Paris Dam Road and go up that way straight up Rattler Hill, or you can start on some forestry tracks towards Ringarooma. If starting from the Cascade Road end, it is a bit of a steep climb up to Rattler Hill, nothing too dramatic, and on a clear sunny day is spectacular views from the Trig station at the top of Rattler Hill. Once you leave Rattler Hill, you keep climbing up a bit and you get to some really cool washouts. So if you've got a big four-wheel drive with some expensive suspension that you want to test out, there are some really great parts of the track where you can really flex your suspension out. You can drive around those sections if you'd prefer not to tackle those. Moving on from there, you've got a couple of options. You can go back on a gravel road back to Mount Paris Dam Road, or you can continue on through an old forestry track that comes out near Ringarooma. I'd highly recommend you do that part of the track as it drives through. It's only short, but it does drive through some pretty cool rainforest. It is a bit scratchy, so just be aware you're probably going to scratch your vehicle on that section of track. Time-wise, it'll probably take you about an hour and a half to do the track, so it's not a long track. As I said, there are spectacular views at the top. I'd recommend, if you're driving something like my Hilux, I'd recommend 31-inch all-terrain tyres and a little bit of a suspension lift. It is quite rocky on some sections of the track. As I said previously, this track is pretty close to the Pyengana Jeep track, so I find that this is a good track to link up with that one. They both will start or end at a similar spot, so you can come through Ringarooma, go down the Pyengana Jeep track, then come back up the Star of Peace track or the Rattler Hill track, and end back up at Ringarooma. There you go, that's the countdown from number 12 to number 7 of Tassie's best four-wheel drive tracks. In an upcoming video, I will count down from number 6 to number 1, but in the meantime, if you would like to experience some of Tassie's best four-wheel drive tracks, find me on Facebook, Tasmanian Off-Road Adventures, or on the website, which is www.tasoffroadadventures.com.au, and come with me on a four-wheel drive tag-along tour and experience the best four-wheel drive tracks that Tassie has to offer.